think we're live. Hello, everyone. Very excited to welcome you guys to another episode of the Mooncast. Today, of course, as always, I have my partner in crime, Razan Nizar, and we have a very special guest today, and it is Adam the Thriller Miller, founder of MIDAO, and he's going to tell us all about MIDAO. But before we get started to MIDAO, I think one of the most important questions you have to ask, who is Adam? So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into the DAO space and with the cross-path regulations?
Yeah, for sure. So I was working for a big American finance company for 6 years, researching cryptocurrencies as well as cybersecurity and data science for them. And while I was researching cryptocurrencies there, I completely saw the light and went down the rabbit hole and decided that I needed to leave and start my own company so that I could really be on the vanguard of blockchain innovation. And I spent about a year researching everything that was happening in blockchain, every job you could do, every role you could have, every company you could start. And I decided that DAOs were what I was most excited about. So I left a capital group to start a DAO technology company. I'm a tech entrepreneur by background, but pretty quickly came across this use case of legal entities and legal issues for DAOs, which I'm sure we'll get into, but kind of happened across that need and that opportunity, which led me to start MIDAO.
Wow. Okay. Impressive. What year did you get into crypto again? Just to get, because everyone has their year reference.
Okay. Technically in 2012, I got into
Wow.
Bitcoin because of the Silk Road. And eventually, it's one of the reasons I think I was hired by Capital Group was because I actually already was familiar. I had traded Bitcoin over the counter in 2012, 2013, I'd always been interested in it. But my real passion didn't emerge until Ethereum and NFTs and DeFi and DAOs and all the cool stuff that you could do, which I didn't realize until later on. But yeah, it was originally 2012.
Okay. Wow. So you have one of the older starting times in the space. So did you ever trade a pizza for a few $100 million by any chance?
What? I can't tell you what I traded, but I was buying and selling things for 100 Bitcoin. Yeah, 50
Wow.
Bitcoin. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Just now you mentioned that you've been doing a lot of researches on cryptocurrency and all these new sectors, and then DAO you picked DAO. So what is it about DAO that piqued your interest basically?
To me, it's the overlap between technology, business, and people, and the intersection of those three things that I've never seen quite so coalesced in one industry or one technology. The fact that the underlying technology is so high tech and it's this leading blockchain cryptography, stuff like that, with the fact that it's all about people, it's all about coordination. Now, some would argue blockchain is all about coordination. And I think that's also true, but DAOs are really the for the coordination component. Yeah. And then it's also the future of every type of business, every type of organization, every type of charity, every type of profit-driven enterprise, every type of government, every type of organization. So you put those three things together, and to me, it's just the most exciting thing that you can work on.
Absolutely. I have to agree with you. I think this is one of the things that really fascinate me about DAOs, and maybe we need to break it down as well. So DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations. They could be both, algorithmic, or they can be member driven. So algorithmic code governs everything, every aspect. And then of course we've all heard about the network state, and I think the network state plays a huge factor in automating normal processes and removing them from board members and trustees, and democratizing that process by giving the voting power to every stakeholder in whatever organization that it is. I think it's a really fascinating concept. I'm as well personally quite in love with it. However, I think there is some issues that are still to be ironed out a little bit when it comes to DAOs. And I think this is where you guys have done something quite special with the MIDAO. So maybe let's talk about that. What are the key issues you think that you guys are specifically solving for by creating this LLC format?
Sure. So when we started this whole project, it was mid-2021, and I was working for a number of DAOs, and we were looking to incorporate our DAOs. And the reason for that, and now most people in crypto understand this too, just like any organization generally needs to incorporate in some way, register in some way, the same thing is true for most crypto projects and most DAOs. And the reason for that is that you need that liability protection. You need a way of accounting for your taxes. so that taxes are not falling on individual members. And you also get benefits like legal personhood that allows an organization to sign a contract, for example, to sponsor an event or open a bank account, right? So for all these reasons, right, DAOs and Web3 projects need legal entities too. Although there's a whole other line of thinking, which is how do we get past that? How do we get around that? The network state, the future of the state, that's all very interesting to me too. But if we just focus on kind of the present, where organizations and people simply need legal entities, we needed legal entities for our DAOs. And we looked at the popular options that were available: Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore. We looked at Panama. We looked at Wyoming and Delaware. Yeah. And there was nowhere that we could register our DAO as a legal entity without making certain compromises. And those compromises were, in particular to us at the time, the requirement to have a board of directors of some kind. Almost everywhere you go, or a management team of some kind, almost every legal entity in the world requires that, and we didn't want that. And some DAOs may want that. We didn't want that, right? The second big thing...
You're absolutely right. Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like when I started reading about DAO, like I'm going to be honest, this is a completely new area to me, like probably known down for just like a year plus. A lot of Marshall Islands is I would say one of the only few that have regulatory framework on DAO. And, even leading APAC countries like Singapore have yet to have a regulatory framework on DAO. And I mean, yeah, you can be incorporated, but, in terms of regulatory framework, for example, if you are a DAO that issue tokens, then you'll be regulated as digital asset business operators instead of a DAO. So there's no DAO regulatory framework. So what is it about DAO? Because earlier you mentioned that you are very into the fact that DAO empowers the members to have the voting rights or control over the entity, right? So how does that address the current problems that we have with how we view corporate governance? Like traditional corporate governance, we are so used or conditioned into thinking that there should be a singular entity or a singular leader, which is completely contrast to DAO. So what is it about the current governance system that, what are the gaps that DAOs are addressing?
Sure, that's a great question. So first of all, I think most people in the DAO industry, although not all, would agree today that what really makes something a DAO is the underlying technology that is being used to track membership or ownership, to perform governance, to do voting, to control software on the blockchain, right? It's using those technologies that makes you a DAO rather than a traditional organization. Now, those technologies introduce new capabilities as far as how you can govern and operate organizations. And those new capabilities can be used to make much more democratic forms of organization, like you're talking about. Leaderless, maybe hierarchy-less, whatever you can imagine. But they can also be used to simply make existing governance systems much more efficient and scalable. So I think actually a lot of the DAOs of the future will look like the traditional organizations of today. You'll have a CEO, you'll have a board, you'll have these other things, but what they've enabled is other possibilities, right? The fact that now it's possible, you look at like if Microsoft wants to hold a vote of the shareholders, it takes months and costs millions of dollars. There literally is no way to do membership tracking and have a vote with millions of people quickly and cheaply before blockchain. Now we can do it. And so now if you want to, you can have all the Microsoft shareholders vote on every snack that they buy for the snack room if you wanted to. Now it's up to founders and entrepreneurs in crypto and increasingly outside of crypto to decide, well, what is the governance structure of the future? What are the models that are going to be more effective for certain use cases and situations that would not have been possible before that are possible now? And we could get into like maybe what some of those optimal models look like, but I think that it's not that there's like a specific gap that the current system has, although there are many you could identify. It's that now there's a whole new set of options for how to govern and operate organizations that people can choose from these new options, the old options, and anything in between.
Absolutely. And I like the example you brought up, like when we were talking about large multinational public listed companies, when it comes to taking shareholder votes on critical decisions, and especially when you have minority shareholders, they have to pull together proxies to create like a larger voice for themselves so they can represent themselves more adequately. And these are things that I see personally that DAO solves quite more efficiently. And then of course there's the filing systems as well, which I really like. Like in the Marshall Islands, correct me if I'm wrong, but when it comes to regular updates of stakeholders to a DAO, it's automatically updated on chain. Therefore, you don't need to do it separately as you would in a traditional corporation.
Right, that's true. So like a company like Microsoft, they are required by law to use a transfer agency amongst many other types of financial intermediaries to track their ownership, to send out communications to their members, to hold a vote, right? And so now there's a way of not only skipping the vote counting, but automatically executing whatever the vote decides. And yeah, so with DAOs and DAO technology, right now there's a way to completely automate that whole process and even have the outcome automatically executed rather than waiting for a board or management team to execute the outcome of the vote.
Absolutely. And this is the blockchain aspect where it's amazing because it's so transparent and immutable. Therefore, you have all these records in place. You don't need further auditing to them, really, like minimal auditing. The chances of manipulating them are going to be very low.
Well, and and that does bring up a good, kind of issue we solve for compared to Cayman Islands and other jurisdictions, right? Is that in a lot of these places, you're using a traditional legal form and you're tying it to the DAO or the Web3 project in some way. So there's some linkage. But yeah, that organization has to do all the stuff traditional organizations do. It has to have a board. It has to have an independent director. It has to produce regular accounting filings and do a certain record keeping on paper. With the DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands, you can do everything on chain. So there is no paper copy that is the official record of members. Your official record, legal record of members is on chain.
I think that's absolutely the part that I love the most. And I'm sorry, I'm like nerding out on the I call it a product, but it's the entire DAO Act of 2022 and the amendments for like sub DAOs and series DAOs, which we'll get to later. It's quite fascinating and gives a lot of flexibility.
So I'm very curious. So like for those who are not in DAO, like we're so used to decision making that would take like once every quarter. That's a typical frequency of board of directors meeting, right? So how, for our viewers out there, like how fast does the technology in DAO? I mean, how fast does it take for decision making process to occur?
Well, you can do it frequently and quickly, right? With the technology, if you want to, people could be submitting proposals every hour or every minute that expire 7 days later or whatever it is they want in that organization. And then people could be always talking about these proposals and voting on them. I think what a lot of DAOs in the last several years have found out. So, there were kind of a few waves of DAOs, right? There was the DAO in 2017. There was, and then there was kind of a second set of DAOs in like 2019, 2020 that launched with this new technology. Now there's a third wave launching. And what those DAOs have learned is that it's not always optimal to be maximally democratic in every way and to have a vote on everything, right? And this is a lot of people from the traditional business world would say, well, we knew that, like and so kind of like DeFi has been speed running the history of finance. I think DAOs are kind of speed running the history of organizational science, organizational structures, and learning that it's just not usually going to make sense to do that. So again, it's like, now that you can have more votes, what's the optimal amount of voting and the optimal stuff to vote on and the optimal governance structure, right? And there's people doing crazy new things. Like you guys have probably heard of Futarchy. Futarchy is a model where you do market-based decision-making rather than even having a vote. And that's and people have talked about it, I think, for a long time. There's been an idea that you could use these types of markets to govern things, but now it's actually being experimented with. So, it's not even just how often to vote. It's, are we even voting? And what is the governance system of the future?
Absolutely. And this is when you head towards these algorithmic types of governance that are based on events that are recorded on chain, and it triggers a decision without having the, a person with the button to click there to say yes or no. Quite fascinating. Now there's a topic that I want to shift gears to, and I think it's really important. That from my understanding with the Marshall Islands, when it first started, the target was for nonprofit DAOs, and then the profit DAOs kind of followed as legislation. And so let's talk a little bit about that, the genesis of the nonprofit DAO, and how did it evolve to the profit DAO licensing?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, the nonprofit DAO LLC, one of the really cool things about it is the first nonprofit LLC in the world. Okay. Forget about the DAO part. Forget about all the crypto stuff. It's the first nonprofit LLC in the world. That alone is actually very innovative, it turns out, because now you have the flexibility of an LLC structure, which is already very flexible, combined with not only a nonprofit, but an offshore nonprofit that's similar to Cayman Islands and Switzerland, where it's truly nonprofit, is very different from a US style kind of nonprofit. And so that is very popular. That's what we launched with because it was actually seen as lower risk at the time just by the legislature in the Marshall Islands. And that was the sense we got, was that it might just feel safer to start with nonprofit. I think actually if you asked international non-government agencies like the IMF and APG, they might actually be more concerned about nonprofits, but for us, it was actually just a little easier to start with nonprofit. And then as soon as the nonprofit was getting some traction, we started working on the law to also introduce the for-profit DAO LLC. And we're going to continue working on this stuff too, right? We've looked at what they're doing with the DUNA in Wyoming, and should we copy the DUNA, do a DUNA with some improvements? And we're not sure yet. We're even thinking about, should we do a Cayman Foundation company in the Marshall Islands for crypto? And not clear, because we still think what we've done is generally better than that. But there are still situations where people say, just like I said before, maybe they say, look, I want a foundation. I'm trying to create a foundation. I want to use the blockchain for, automating elements of it, but I want a foundation. Okay, great. So maybe we should even do a foundation too. But yeah, today it's nonprofit and for-profit DAO LLC.
And that brings to another question, right? I'm glad that you brought up foundations. Are foundations recognized currently in the Marshall Islands, independent of a DAO? Because usually I know like foundations are more prevalent in civil law type of jurisdictions. Common law has a different setup for them altogether. How do they fall in the Marshall Islands?
So one of the interesting things about the Marshall Islands is the registry is kind of split down the middle between two private companies that help manage the registry for the country. We are one of those companies. We do only DAO LLCs, for-profit and nonprofit. There's another company that does other offshore registry. They have corporations, they have trusts. I'm actually not sure if they technically have a foundation company. The thing is, all of their corporate types do not get the benefit of the crypto legislation and regulation that we're writing in the Marshall Islands. So when we do it, we say, okay, it all applies to the DAO LLC, basically. So we may introduce other forms for crypto, even that mirror what the other company / registry does. But yeah, today we don't have that.
Okay, it's very good to know. Yeah. Kind of similar to Dubai as well. If you go to the UAE, for example, you have different free zones, and each free zones have their own registry and they have their own system and their own corporate structures. So that makes a lot of sense. But let's go back to the nonprofits because I'm really excited about this. So, okay, what can a nonprofit do? And I know this might sound very elementary, but it's really important to clarify what can they cannot do under the Marshall Islands.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, a nonprofit, and it's very similar to other jurisdictions, it has to be mission-driven, purpose-driven. So you have to state to the government and to the world what your purpose is, and then you have to stick to that. And so that purpose could be benefiting a community around an ecosystem, around a protocol, and the people involved even could be part of that community. That's okay. But they'll have to focus on that community for all time. Now, you can apply for a purpose change as long as it's relatively minor, but the kind of the idea globally is that when someone donates to a nonprofit, right, or gives money to a nonprofit or whatever, they're expecting that nonprofit to stick with the mission that it told the world. Mm-hmm. The other side of it is that a nonprofit cannot distribute profit as dividends and it doesn't have owners, but to its members. It's allowed to make money, so it can make a lot of profit. It can build up that profit over time in its treasury. That's totally fine to build that wealth. It can pay for managers, if it wants managers, service providers. It can pay other firms. It can pay licensing fees. It can pay for services. It can pay for labor. So, and again, those people can be related to the organization. So, people are sometimes come in worried, am I going to be able to pay myself a salary? Can we pay our DevCo to do stuff? Yes, you can do all of that. You can engage in any reasonable business transaction. You just, at the end of the day, cannot distribute those profits to your members as if they were owners of a for-profit company.
Absolutely. So it's one, obviously you cannot pay dividends. So that's kind of a key thing because then you are a for-profit business. And what is the tax benefits that they get as a nonprofit LLC, DAO LLC at the Marshall Islands?
I mean, the tax benefit is that there's no taxes. So there's simply no taxes. It's the same as a Cayman Foundation or Swiss Association in that regard, to my knowledge. There's simply no taxes.
No taxes on income, no taxes on, there's no VAT, nothing that applies. That's fantastic. Sounds
No,
good.
you have to consider wherever the nonprofit is operating, right? They may have to pay taxes based on those local operations or where they're hiring someone, right? And if they did have local operations in the Marshall Islands, which none of them do at this point, except for us as the registered agent having an office for them there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just now you mentioned that it's easier to set up nonprofit DAO. Like, does that relate to the taxation? Like, what do you think it's easier to set up a nonprofit DAO?
It was easier for us to set up the legislative framework for the nonprofit. It's no easier or harder for founders who want to create a nonprofit versus a for-profit. I mean, you could argue that the for-profit is harder because now tax is an issue. You got to have now, luckily, a revenue tax, it's a revenue tax. It's actually easier than an income tax because you don't have to produce these extensive documents calculating your profit for tax purposes. You just say, here's my top line revenue, here's my taxes. Yeah.
Okay. And what is the revenue tax for the profit DAO?
3%.
That's also very low.
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, you got to consider it's a revenue tax, so it sounds lower than it is compared to a profit tax. We are actually working on, eventually we're going to help the Marshall Islands modernize their offshore taxing so that it is an income tax and so that it's competitive with other offshore jurisdictions for profit. So that's probably going to be like a 3 to 9% profit tax, but
Absolutely.
we're not there yet.
I mean, that makes sense because then you have that intentional markup that's going to apply to anything that you're going to be selling to factor in that 3%. Which makes them less competitive, as you said, if they are competing in a saturated market. Okay, so I can see now the difference between the nonprofit and the profit. However, there are still some questions pending. Let's think about a nonprofit like a layer one blockchain. Like, Ethereum are very known to have a nonprofit organization that runs ETH, and then they have Consensus, which is another arm that does the for-profit type of structures. So in this case, let's say I am Ethereum and I decided to come to the Marshall Islands DAO and I want to create a nonprofit there. In the case of ETH, it's widely classified as a utility token. It's not considered a security token. Depends on who you ask. In Singapore, we discussed this with residents. In Singapore, I believe Ethereum is considered a security token, correct?
Yeah, security in Malaysia.
In Malaysia as well, right? But in Switzerland, it's considered more of a utility token. So how is it viewed in the Marshall Islands as such a case?
Well, I think it's important to give the caveat that when you're structuring a legal entity or any legal structure for a crypto project, it's not usually as simple as simply incorporating the whole thing, right? No, you can't incorporate Ethereum. It just doesn't even really make sense. Ethereum is a whole system with all kinds of components. What you might do is say, well, we want to incorporate a DAO where everyone who holds Ethereum is a member of the DAO, right? Even that sounds kind of crazy today, but like maybe when you're starting out a protocol, you say everyone who has a token is a member of the DAO. And so that creates a bit of a legal difference between the token as it's used with the DAO and the token when it's used for other purposes, right? So it can get kind of complicated. I think what we see, and the other thing to keep in mind too, right, is that almost any protocol has this kind of separation of protocol and legal form. And the reason I say that is think about like Uniswap and Uniswap Labs. No one is arguing, maybe some like ultra extreme anti-crypto people, but almost no one is arguing that the activity that takes place with the Uniswap protocol is actually part of Uniswap Labs' business activity. No one's saying account for it, pay taxes on it, nothing like that. So most of our DAO LLCs in the Marshall Islands are similar. There may be a DeFi protocol or some kind of blockchain or protocol of any kind that the DAO is governing and building and even supporting and marketing, but that doesn't make it the same thing. So that's one thing you kind of have to think about. I think the best thing we have in the Marshall Islands from a token perspective that I think a lot of people find really beneficial is that a governance token of a nonprofit DAO LLC is explicitly stated to be not a security. And it's because you're not allowed to return dividends to the whole person who holds that token. Now, securities laws usually apply based on where you sell the token, not where your company is registered, but it can still help you to have good and clear treatment in the jurisdiction where you're registered. Even if you're fighting with the SEC in the United States or in other situations, it can still be helpful to have that good treatment.
Very important to note. I think this is the most common question that I get from clients that approach us and they're asking about different jurisdictions. Many of the things that comes up is this, that I have a utility token that could be staked. If it's staked, obviously gives you governance power. So it's definitely a utility type of token. However, these tokens also can increase in value. And if they increase in value, would they then be considered as security? If I'm staking them, if I'm earning more tokens of the same governance tokens for staking, right? Then it's not really a dividend, but it is kind of, and different jurisdictions, as you exactly said, will treat it differently. So despite you being, I guess, clear in the Marshall Islands as a security token holder, if you're planning to sell this in a jurisdiction like Malaysia that considered it as a security, then you have a lot of homework to do before you go to that market, or you decide to screen these investors. There's a lot of strategies to mitigate your risks and apply them. That makes a lot of sense. So then let's talk about VASP licenses in the Marshall Islands. What is the horizon looking at that? Because as of today, there isn't any. And as we know, any DAO that comes in is planning to launch a token of some sort or have custodies of token. There's wide applications. So how do you see the horizon looking there?
Well, so far, there is one VASP law. It's part of another law that has a short 4-bullet point description of what would make you a VASP. And if you meet that description, you would need a license. Those licenses are not currently available. So you're right, you cannot currently operate a VASP in the Marshall Islands, but the definition is very narrow. So launching a token does not make you a VASP in the Marshall Islands. Now, again, if that makes you a VASP somewhere else and you're operating in that place, you've got to look at whether you have considerations you need to take into account. But in the Marshall Islands, most things that DAOs and crypto companies do is just not considered a VASP. I think that's a real overreach and mistake of certain regulatory environments to say because you launched a token, you're a VASP. I mean, that's kind of crazy. We really look at, like, are you custodying assets, including digital assets, on behalf of other people? Like, are you operating an exchange or a bank, or for some reason you need to custody someone else's asset? In that case, you're a VASP. And I know there can still be some gray area there. We could get into it, but that's how we approach it today. We are actually starting to work on a VASP regulation because we do want to eventually allow for VASPs to exist in the Marshall Islands as well, but it's not ready yet.
It's not there yet. But that's good that you mentioned that it's not highly regulated either. So there is an area, or not highly regulated. It's narrowly applied in the Marshall Islands what constitutes a VASP act or it doesn't. So issuing a token in itself is not a VASP, which is really great because not a lot of jurisdictions apply this leniency.
Yeah. And I mean, this is for education purpose for our viewers out there. Like, a lot of regulators are still struggling to categorize VASP, and they automatically place anyone who issues tokens to be, fall under the category of VASP, which is, critical because then that means FATF rules applies to them. So in your opinion, why if a company launches a token, they don't necessarily mean that, they fall under the VASP category?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, first of all, imagine you're launching like an NFT project that's just art and collectibles, right? I mean, let's talk about DAOs too. So you're launching a token to act as ownership of a company, and you're selling those tokens. So you're selling ownership of your company to other people. I mean, just where in there does anything come up that makes you remotely a financial services company? That's what every single company on earth pretty much does. They have ownership, they sell it to people. That does not make them a VASP. It doesn't matter whether you're representing that ownership on paper or a transfer agent or the blockchain. That's not going to make you a financial services company, or which is like the TradFi VASP, right? Yeah. So I just think it's just a big mistake for Europe and certain other jurisdictions to try to apply that VASP rule broadly. And there's no way that's going to happen in the United States with this new administration. And I think eventually everyone will have to adjust. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's something I could do right now on my computer. I could go launch a token and like send it to you guys. That would make me a VASP? That's just totally ridiculous.
Yeah. I tend to agree as well with that logic, except I think there's a caveat here. It depends who you're selling this token to, because if you're doing a Haktua type of token, right, and you're selling it to retail investors versus seasoned investors, then also in the United States, there's a difference when you sell your shares to the public or you're selling it to, seasoned investors. There's different considerations.
Yeah. Definitely. But all of that is about securities laws. That's not about VASP laws, right? That's at least in the States, it's totally separate things. And I think in most places, Those are different things. Yeah.
Correct.
So
Correct.
definitely a lot of, there's going to be a whole new regime in the US and everywhere eventually for securities also, which is going to be really important. But yeah, I think when it comes to VASP, it just doesn't make sense for countries to throw everything related to tokens in with VASPs.
And I wonder why that's the case. I wonder why they're throwing it with VASP. My only, I would say, assumption here, it's that in the previous world, pre-tokenization, it was a lot more difficult for you to go public with any type of company or, issue it. But now it's so easy that they just got freaked out. They're like, we need to protect the market. We need to protect consumers. So let's make it more difficult. Let's add some further due diligence. I think that's what it is. It's just a reaction.
Yeah. They're saying,
agree. I think it's just a reaction.
They're looking at the one of the major benefits of the technology and saying that we're going to reduce that benefit. The thing that it makes so much easier than it had ever been before, we're going to make it so that you can't do that. I mean, it's just, to me, that's like cutting off the innovation way, way, way too early. We don't even know how this stuff's going to be used. And the fact that I could, even just the fact that I could just go sit here on my computer and do the thing in 5 minutes, pretty much means it shouldn't be regulated the way it is. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Let's see what people do and find a new way to regulate it.
Absolutely. And I like that you said that this current administration has a different view, because I'm like part European. So in Europe and Sweden, we love regulations. We love to regulate the shit out of everything. And I love the latest memes coming up on the internet. They're like, what has Europe invented? You have that bottle cap that doesn't fully come off. And then you have like China with their drones. So it tells you a little bit, our market of innovation is dying from over regulation. And I think Europe is realizing this a bit too late. Now it's like in the correction phase as well. So
yeah, it's tough. And I think the US may be realizing it just in time. I don't think it's ever too late. I think these things go through cycles, but what you want to avoid is just a country or series of countries falling into complete ruin before they go back to being more free market capitalists.
Absolutely. I mean, can you imagine if people start like regulating email providers in the early 90s because there were some Nigerian princes scamming people, and they're like, "Oh my God, put this down, guys."
Yeah,
go back to snail mail.
Right, and it's better to let some companies are trying to get away from email. If they can find a way, they will. Right, and when people can find a way, I'd much prefer my Telegram and stuff to email. Eventually, we'll all move away from it because of those princes, right? But yeah, you don't need the government regulating that out of the gate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. So I think we covered a lot about, the different types of DAOs. So tell us about how has it been for you guys at the Marshall Islands DAO? How many DAOs have you registered so far? If you're allowed to talk about that, and
sure.
How do you see it growing?
Yeah, so we're approaching 250 projects signed up, many of which are already registered, some of which are in process. Over the past 3 years. Most of those were last year. It's like 150 or so were last year. And I'd say we have become a very successful small business. And now we're looking to growing and trying to be very successful. And when I say business, MIDAO actually is it's not a DAO, by the way. It's DAO's in the name, but MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO, is a public-private partnership between our private company and the government of the Marshall Islands. And I'd say it's off to a good start. We're generating in the hundreds of thousands of revenue for the government of the Marshall Islands. But to really move the needle for them, we've got to get that up into the millions. And obviously, that's what we want as a business as well. So the next phase is, can we take it to the next level?
That's amazing. Wow. And how long has it been set up since the act was passed? So 2022, right?
Late 2021, actually almost on Thanksgiving in the US. And we announced the project at ETH Denver 3 years ago. And that's coming up now next week. So it'll be about 3 years since we announced the project.
Wow. And how did that come about? Like how did that lead to the DAO Act?
Yeah, and how did you find the Marshall Islands? How did that?
Yeah. So we found the Marshall Islands actually through a prior crypto project, which was called the SOV cryptocurrency project. And that was a project that was moving forward until it got shut down basically by international and US regulators, like even folks like Treasury and Fed basically said you can't do it. This was in 2017. And everyone, even the World Bank, IMF was like, crypto's too risky, you can't touch it. and convinced them not to do it. But my now co-founder was hired to do consulting for that project and stayed in touch with a senator, now Minister Paul in the Marshall Islands, a top-level government official, stayed in touch with him. And they would always talk, what's a cool thing we could do that leverages the Marshall Islands' strengths as a nation and experience with crypto to drive innovation and generate revenue? By the way, this goes one step back is, why does the Marshall Islands even care about generating revenue and digital economy? It's because the nature of the country's geology is such that its hundreds of islands over 29 atolls are extremely flat. So like they joke that when we drive by, when I'm visiting, there's this pile of dirt that's like 6 feet tall. That's the highest point on the island. Well, now there's a landfill that's like 20 feet tall. It's the highest point on the island. What this means is on all the islands, the entire country is going to be literally underwater in under 50 because of climate change. At least that's what climate scientists are saying. Unless they build seawalls, do land reclamation, that's going to cost also about $50 billion. So they need, and no one's coming close to providing that kind of assistance. The U.S., international bodies, climate change groups, they just don't have that kind of funding. And so the Marshall Islands basically is fighting for its survival here to find ways to generate revenue. So my co-founder is having these conversations with Minister Paul on an ongoing basis. When my co-founder and I recognized the challenge that DAOs were having and the opportunity to do something in the legal world, we knew the Marshall Islands was big in the shipping industry already for jurisdiction. So we talked to now Minister Paul about it, and he was excited. We started co-writing a law. Wyoming had just passed their law also, so we got to give Wyoming credit for being the first DAO law in the world. We then passed the second. Also, you could say it's just the first non-US, or it's the first offshore or even first sovereign nation to pass a DAO specific law. Now it's really, broader to Web3. But that's kind of how it all started.
Wow.
That's crazy. So basically the threat of climate change is the driver of DAO.
In the Marshall Islands.
Yeah, it's the driver of crypto innovation. And by the way, pretty soon we're going to announce our second big Marshall Islands project. So I'll give you like the absolute shortest version. It's a interest-bearing stablecoin. I can't go into many more details yet, but you'll hear about it soon. What this is really becoming is more than just DAOs. It's more than just legal entities. It's really how can our team, and eventually we want to bring other people in too, other founders. And we've talked about starting a DAO. We don't have a DAO ourselves, even though we are all about DAOs. I'm part of a lot of DAOs, but when do we start the Marshall Islands DAO, which a lot of people call MIDAO that, but when is like the DAO for everything we're doing, for stablecoin, for legal entity, for future innovation? How can we leverage that DAO to bring in other innovators with ideas for laws, regulations, anything only a country can do?
Absolutely.
What do they want to bring to the table that could drive innovation?
I would be one of the first people to join your DAO, because I think we also need more legal professionals. We need more compliance professionals as well into the mix, because I see your channels on Telegram. It's filled with lawyers. Everyone is like, it's an area that fascinates lawyers. Everyone was like, okay, let's see what this is all about. Amazing. And I think one thing you've mentioned as well, and it's worth mentioning about the Marshall Islands. I mean, the Marshall Islands is home to over 40 public listed companies on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, major shipping ports. So I think that's also, for me, one of the reasons why I recommend the jurisdiction to the clients that approach us. It just gives you the credibility if you want a credible place. To me, it's kind of like really competitive with the Cayman Islands, but it's less known than the Cayman Islands.
Yeah, for sure.
I think the DAO really puts a differentiation here.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. And to what we were talking about earlier, the more compelling VASP or non-VASP, distinction. Yeah.
Of course. I mean, that's a big one. But again, as we said, I think most projects that come to us are not really concerned with VASP. If they are looking at different jurisdictions. There is BVI, there is British Virgin Islands, of course, Cayman Islands, UAE is really huge into that. And who knows, maybe the Marshall Islands will follow suit soon and introduce a VASP licensing structure. We'll tie everything perfectly together. One aspect we didn't cover a little bit, and I know in 2023, there was an amendment to the original act where you've introduced the idea of a series DAO and sub-DAOs. And this obviously could apply for both profit and non-profit, but can you run us through this? And what is common use cases you've seen clients using the structure for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the Series DAO LLC is really interesting. It's based off of the Series LLC, which again was invented, I think, in Wyoming, just like the LLC itself, and then quickly, copied in Delaware. But the Series LLC allows you to have kind of one company that is made up of lots of little companies. And those little companies actually have some separation of assets and liabilities between each other according to law. And so that can be really useful. Even actually, one of the famous court cases when the Series LLC was very new was a taxi cab company owner. And he created, actually, he may have even done separate LLCs, but let's just go with the story for the sake of conversation. He created a different series for each taxi cab. And then he got sued. Someone said, well, you shouldn't be able to do that. It's too easy. And the government said, no, that's what we were trying to do. We're trying to create the ability for one company to have separate assets and liabilities. So if you want to sue one taxi series, go for it, but you're not touching the other taxis. So you get that separation. So how does that apply to the world of DAOs? Well, DAOs and sub-DAOs, and that's the obvious use case. And we do see that. Another interesting one. So there's a use case for Series LLCs we don't like, which is companies like Autoco, you may have heard of, which is actually, they have one Series LLC and they're selling individual series within that master to independent projects and saying, here's a LLC. And they actually, I hate that they say LLC. Eventually in the fine print, it says this is not a full LLC, it's a Series LLC, but they're selling it to an independent project. And that's not what it was made for. And I don't think that's going to hold up in the long run. But one thing that I think you can use it for that's a little bit in between is, let's say you have a platform, a crypto related platform, let's say that's helping artists set up fan clubs through their platform. One click, you got a fan club, you got a token, you got collaboration tool, you got messaging. And by the way, it comes with a Series DAO LLC that gives you and your community certain legal protections without you having to start your own company. I think that type of use case can make sense where you have a very specific use case where it's kind of like one company, but it's kind of like lots of separate projects in a way. And we also have people doing that where they're actually creating series for semi-independent, like spin-offs in a way from the main platform. Yeah.
But I see that this is really fascinating. So let me get a bit like a better understanding of this. Okay, let's say I'm a company that is selling, let's say, tokens that represents real world assets. And I decide to create one collection for supercars, another one for, I don't know, crazy Italian motorcycles, right? And then I decide to sell, these in separate projects. And let's say I have the vast licensing to do so. So or if it's not even required, I don't know. In this case, it's for profit would do it, right? Because you could actually run this for profit. Anyways, let's say in that structure, would I be able to separate liability completely from these two different collections of cars and motorcycles? If someone goes after one, they cannot go after the other?
Here's the caveat. Well, one caveat I should have given at the beginning is that I'm not a lawyer, right? And
of course,
obviously nothing I say is legal advice.
Yeah, nothing we say here is legal advice, just to be very clear.
It can't be legal advice because I'm literally not a lawyer. So everyone should know that. What I've learned, though, is that Series LLCs may be and have been treated differently by different countries, irrespective of the fact that they're registered in Wyoming or the Marshall Islands. If someone ends up in court in Switzerland related to a Series LLC matter, and this doesn't just apply to DAOs, it's any Series LLC, that court might not respect the difference in assets and liabilities or other features that you were going for from that DAO, sub-DAO, or master series structure. And so it's not necessarily perfect right now all over the world. And that's just because different courts haven't all accepted it, like they have corporations and LLCs and stuff like that. So there's some nuances. Almost everything we're discussing, by the way, as I think you know, there's always little nuances and little exceptions and stuff like that.
But it was good to dig into that one because I was wondering if it could be a substitute to SPVs, which is like special purpose vehicles, as an investment vehicle, right? And I'm not sure it would be. If it doesn't have wide recognition yet, then probably a bit premature. But it's more fitting for projects like you've mentioned. Like if it's an artist community or there's different means to go about this.
Well, people are using it for SPVs. So I think it is. I do think it's a good use case for that too. I think you just want to look at where are the investors? Where are the companies you're investing in? Is there any reason to expect that there would be any issue specifically related to investment funds? It would take a little research to really dig into it. But yeah, we do have people doing that.
I mean, this is the struggle that I find, as someone who works in the legal field. For me, what's really difficult is that there isn't much case law yet on these type of issues, especially cross-border, from offshore to cross-border transactions that are happening. There isn't much that I've read about yet. There's few exceptional cases that have affirmed that, yes, an LLC, a DAO LLC is a possible thing that you can shield members, removing them from the partnership. There's very early, case law, but there isn't really any details yet. So we always operate in this gray area. And I get a lot of clients that get frustrated. They're like, why do you tell us that it's a gray area? I was like, well, because it largely is.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Not just from legal point of view, from compliance point of view as well. Like when I try to do research on how to implement compliance control on DAO, it's just there's not many best practices or use cases, which led me, I do have a question like on in terms of compliance or legal, like the whole structure of DAO is to ensure that the members, remain anonymous, right? So those who are not used to DAO structure, they are not used to that. They're used to the fact that, governance, the members are KYC, the members are, you conduct due diligence on the members. So how can DAO members remain compliant while being fully anonymous, do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, not all DAOs see anonymity as a core reason for being or a feature that they even endorse, right? So I'm part of DAOs where we all know each other and we wouldn't even probably let someone in if we didn't know them. So it's not like every DAO is focused on that, but it is true that many DAOs and a lot of what the tech is used for is to allow for anyone to buy the token, right? And if it's a governance or ownership token and someone buys it and you haven't KYC'd them, you're not going to know who it is. So it is true that that is very common. I would say, first of all, there's two things going on here from a compliance perspective. So one is that it's really pseudonymity, not anonymity, right? Which means, right? Because we do have their address. Now look at a traditional company. Law enforcement does not know all the owners of MIDAO. They just don't know. They'd have to look into it. They'd have to get a warrant. It's just not how traditional companies work. With DAO LLCs, people actually do have to register their smart contract addresses with the government. We actually monitor those addresses with Chainalysis. We watch not only every DAO, every member of every DAO, and is someone trying to do a Sybil of some kind? Who are the people that are transferring a lot of money in and out of the DAO? And we want to watch them a little extra. So in some ways, even though we don't know the person's traditional identity, we're doing even more compliance and kind of watching of the company than you can do in the traditional financial system. So that's a trade-off. And by the way, there are some KYC requirements for, like, we do have beneficial owner information, beneficial owner reporting requirements. They usually only apply to one or up to a few people, but at least, that somebody's doing it.
Yeah. So the way it works, for example, like I'm used to how cryptocurrency operates in transaction monitoring or screening, for example. So in DAO, like you mentioned, there's an address. So those address, when you use Chainalysis, you screen them against sanctions lists, you screen them against fraud list, etc. Right? So it works very similarly in that process. Am I right?
Yeah. And we also do traditional KYC, AML, CFT on the beneficial owners or the people who report. If there are no beneficial owners, we still have one person report.
To require at least one person, right? That's
at
what
least
I read.
one person.
At least one person.
Yeah. Now, you can have a company, a legal person, be the beneficial owner or the person who's doing that KYB, but then still we eventually get to the UBOs, the ultimate beneficial owners, who do have to KYC. Yeah.
Related to that question again, I'm trying to relate back to your earlier statement. You mentioned that not all DAO is a VAS, for example. I'm aware of FATF travel rule. Like, does that affect DAO at all? Or if yes, like how so?
Yeah, a lot. So look, a lot of financial rules apply to companies irrespective of whether they're a VASP, right? And a lot of those rules apply to us as a registered agent that's working with the government. So we're treated as a non-financial corporate service provider, which is this classification they use in a lot of the world. It's like being a financial services company, just a little bit different. So we're heavily regulated. We're always researching the latest FATF and IMF and APG. We talk to all these people. I would say they more affect how we operate than in our companies may have some obligations, and they should be aware of those, like from an international AML standpoint or with respect to whatever countries they're operating in. And we also may cross the line into enforcing some of that stuff. But one thing that's important to consider is, as a registered agent, even though we also act as we help run the registry, we do not have a lot of law enforcement requirements, right? If you look at Delaware's Secretary of State does not investigate all the companies that are registered in Delaware. That is not their job, right? They have a very small area of responsibility. And now other law enforcement agencies have to enforce all the other laws on those companies registered in Delaware. So that often applies in our situation as well, where there may be law enforcement and requirements that apply to our companies. That doesn't mean it's our job to enforce all of those.
It's very cool. Yeah.
What is your best advice for DAOs looking to scale safely?
Safely puts an interesting twist on the question, because usually the answer is to make sure you have a purpose and that it's documented. Because in most DAOs, there's some level of openness compared to traditional orgs. And that means if people can just come join or ask to join, you want them to self-filter themselves, right? So that if they're not actually interested in what you're trying to do, even if your purpose is we're going to do literally nothing and just have fun, but people need to know that so they can join the right DAO and decide whether to take part in it and to keep people aligned. So I don't know, safely, I mean, that can help you grow safely in the sense of keeping your membership aligned. When it comes to safety, maybe use good technology. I mean, that's probably obvious, but we can also help people with that. It's like we have partners that do DAO technology. Very recently, I've become very excited about something called Decent, DECENT, which we can get people connected with. They're going to be launching big time at ETH Denver this year, and that's a great tech tool. So having a good tech and there's a few components you got to put together when you're making a DAO. So just to make sure you do that stuff carefully, or hire a consultant, right? Like I talked to some guys recently, they're iBankers in New York, and they're looking to get into the space. If they can afford it, like hire a consultant who's built a number of DAOs before from a tech perspective, at least, and who has technology to offer, and let them help you with that.
Thank you so much, Adam. We learned a lot from you. We learned, especially for regulators out there as well, like we learned on how we should approach DAO. We learn on, how we shouldn't just classify all DAOs into a vast, there should be a clear distinction. We learn, how DAOs should actually also, approach the organization with, a level of integrity and compliance as well. And thank you so much for your insights. But I think I have one important question before we wrap up. Why is Adam the Thriller?
The Thriller is my nickname, and I always struggle to decide whether to just go 100% nickname or 100% real name, especially because of the trust nature of what we do at MIDAO. It's like people do kind of have to trust us that we're actually real, and that it's, again, we're not lawyers, but like it's kind of like being a lawyer in terms of they have to trust us in that way. And I've always felt like maybe using my real name helps, but I like my nickname. The nickname comes from college because my last name is Miller. One time in a locker room ice hockey meeting, someone said the Thriller instead of Miller, and everyone laughed. This was freshman year, and that was my nickname through college. And I just have had the chance to bring it back for crypto.
I mean, to be honest, it's not a bad name. It's a badass name. I mean,
it's a pretty cool name.
So how can our listeners get started with MIDAO? And what resources does MIDAO offer for DAO founders?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find us on our website, MIDAO.org, MIDAO.org, or for the really good info, the deep info, go to docs.MIDAO.org. So that's our documentation, and we go into a lot more detail there. Of course, you can find us on Twitter. We are MIDAO DS for directory services because MIDAO wasn't available. Farcaster, we're just at MIDAO. I'm going to ETH Denver. If anyone hears this before ETH Denver, reach out. Yeah, any of those ways. And by the way, we're always happy to just chat with people and also introduce them to lawyers. So as you know, Sanad, we have a network of lawyers and other corporate service providers all over the world that can help people with either local or international issues. We have Marshall Islands lawyers when that's needed, or nominee services. If anyone just wants to talk and get introduced to some of these folks, there's no cost of that, right? I'm always happy to just chat with anyone and make sure they get connected with the right resources.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, guys. Have a wonderful evening, or you should probably catch up on some sleep, Resin. And thank you again, Adam. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys.